Something is wrong with the sound again.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Risk Reduction for September, where we're going to talk about the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. And this is a two-part class in all probability. I don't think I can get through both the agreement itself and all the related forms in 1 hour. So I divided it up. I think we'll take a good bit of an hour just to get through the first form, the BRBC, the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. And then next month, we'll do 6 associated forms with the buyer broker agreement. We'll go through those in detail. I will reference those forms today, and your handout has all of the forms for your reference. So let me get right started. Let me share my screen, and there we go. All right. Of course, as always, if you have any questions at all about it, anything related to real estate, not only just this class, but any transactional questions, sales questions, anything I can help you with at all, don't hesitate to reach out to me. The best way to reach me during the business hours is on my direct line. You see the number on the screen there in red. I keep pretty close tabs on my phone, my landline. You can email me, of course. There's my email address. And evenings and weekends, don't hesitate to call my cell. Probably best to text my cell and then ask me to call you or alert me that you're trying to, you want to speak with me. I don't always keep my ringer on in the evenings, but I keep the phone within arm's length all the time. So those are the ways, of course, to reach me. All right, let's talk about the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, the BRBC. We'll discuss some of the related forms as we go through the BRBC, and then we'll cover the related forms in great detail in our next session. So some advantages of using the buyer representation agreement. One of my hopes, one of my goals is to demystify the form a little bit and encourage agents to use the form. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. This is the direction real estate is going in. And so just like real estate agents really needed to master the ability to list properties, and that really, moved the real estate industry ahead a great deal once a exclusive right to represent a seller became common practice. That's the direction now with working with buyers as well. The exclusive right to represent buyers is going to be the direction of the future. So what are the advantages? Well, first of all, it facilitates establishing a relationship with your buyer. When you go through this form with your buyer, it establishes that there's a professional business relationship between the two of you, and there's quite a bit of details about how that relationship is governed contained within the form, and you'll see what I mean as we go through it. It establishes your expectations for compensation. Early on, buyers should realize you're not working for free. You're not a taxi service. You're going to provide very valuable service to the buyer, and of course, you have an expectation of being compensated for that service. It clearly explains how you are compensated and how you can be compensated other than the buyer actually paying you. And the form explains that as well. Details your obligations to the buyer, and it states your expectations from the buyer, what you can expect or what you want to expect that the buyer does to facilitate your representation of the buyer. It also protects you in a procuring cause dispute. One of the surest ways of preventing a procuring cause dispute from even occurring is for the other agent to realize you have a buyer representation agreement. And in fact, it makes it harder for another agent to, steal your client. Most agents don't do that, I know, but there are a few agents that might try to entice your client away from you. I can't promise you that they can't succeed at that, but it's going to make it much more difficult for that agent to succeed at that. It establishes a minimum commission that you will accept. The wave of the future could very well be sellers are going to offer zero compensation to a buyer broker. That could be the case. There are MLSs now, and some major MLSs that allow listing agents to put properties in the MLS with zero compensation to the buyer's agent, with the assumption that, look, the buyer's agent will pay for their own agent, the seller's only paying for his agent. Right now, our MLS allows a commission as low as $1. And in a seller's market, we're maybe shifting a little bit away from that, but in a very, very hot seller's market, there was more and more properties in the MLS with minimal commissions being offered. And so this helps protect you from being forced to or be put in a position to have to represent a buyer and to accept a very minimum compensation for that. So that's a nice feature of this BRBC. And then finally, and it's something that Dennis was referencing, and I want to talk a little bit about it. It fulfills your ethical obligations for transparency and presenting a true picture regarding your compensation. NAR is moving in the direction to make it an ethical requirement that you disclose to the buyer exactly the compensation you are receiving if anyone else is paying that compensation to you. And there is some reference to that even now. You have to, no hidden profits. A true picture of your compensation is supposed to be presented. It's not completely established yet, but it's moving in that direction. There are lawsuits in place that are going to ultimately require that buyers be fully informed that they are in fact the ones paying the commission. It makes sense. I've talked about this in the past. It does make sense from a practical aspect. The buyer really does pay the commission. Why? Because it's built into the price of the home, obviously. And the Department of Justice is adamant that be very clearly understood, and more importantly, that the buyer have the ability to negotiate the commission that is going to be paid to their agent because they're paying it. And that's the direction that we'll probably find ourselves in the next couple of years. I would suggest that if you're as old as me, you might be, I don't know, there's too many people on the call that are old as me, but there are a few of you getting close. If you're up in years, how many more years are you going to be doing real estate? We've lost a few very good agents to retirement. There's a point where you just don't want to do this anymore. So I could argue that a very senior agent may not see the day where a buyer broker agreement is going to be an absolute necessity, just like a listing agreement is an absolute necessity with sellers. It's not an absolute necessity yet, but that day is coming. And maybe if you're a senior, you may not be too concerned about that. But if you're a young person on this call, within a few years, you'll probably be in a position that you will not be paid to represent buyers unless you have a buyer representation agreement. It just, you can't be paid to represent sellers unless you have a listing agreement or a commission agreement with the seller who's paying it. That is the direction with buyers ultimately. I will throw in that if you are senior, one of the ways to keep yourself sharp and mentally alert is to constantly take on new challenges. And so learning how to do this even at an advanced state in your career could be beneficial to you in the long run anyway. So a lot of good reasons to get involved in starting to use the buyer representation agreement. Now, the buyer representation agreement is very buyer friendly. It really is. It can be an asset, a sales asset, if you will, if you present it properly and go through it with the buyer in a professional manner. It details how a seller can cover the buyer's financial obligations to pay the commission. So it's going to take that sting away from the buyer thinking they're going to have to fork over some money if they're going to hire you. Not necessarily. That cost can be passed on to the seller. And then secondly, it can be canceled. This agreement can be canceled if the buyer's not completely happy with your service. And with only one exception, it doesn't lock a buyer in to an agent they're no longer happy with. And so you'll see how that works as we go through this. So part one of today's presentation is going to be the BRBC, the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Form. So it's a 3-page form, and we're going to go through it almost line by line. I'm going to point out some of the features of this form and give you some tips and ideas about how to utilize this form. So let's start right at the top. Paragraph 1 is the representation period and the right to represent. It identifies who the buyer is. It identifies who the broker is, which is Remax Connections, and then yourself. You can put your name, Remax Connections, and then Walt Klein, if I'm the buyer's agent, I would put that on the blank. And then all contracts, real estate contracts, have to have a beginning and an end, a specific time it starts and a specific time it ends. A contract is invalid without that. So of course it has a beginning date. That's pretty, typical, just like a listing contract. But the ending so-called date is a little different on the BRBC. It is not a date specific, it's a days specific. So instead of having an ending date, it commences on September 20th, 2023 and ends on September 20th, 2024. Instead of saying that, you would have to write in 365 days if you were taking a year-long contract. I would argue you don't have to take a year-long contract or even a 6-month contract because, as I said before, it's cancelable anyway. And in fact, one of the ways to make this form very buyer-friendly is to initially make it for a very short period of time and then tell the buyer, if you want to, if we agree, if you like working with me and I feel like I can continue to help me, then we'll extend this agreement. And you'll see how that works in a few minutes as we go through the form. Okay. It's the default is a non-exclusive right, and you'll see what I mean by that when we get to paragraph 4B. If 4B2 is checked, then it's an exclusive right, but the default is it's a non-exclusive right to represent the buyer. And paragraph 2, the buyer states they have no pre-existing buyer representation agreements. It's an affirmative statement they're making, except they can identify any broker or any properties that have been protected, and any brokers they signed a buyer broker agreement with, and any property that have been protected by that buyer broker agreement, that broker in the past. And so they can list a property that maybe another agent showed them, assuming they also, going hand in hand with that, they signed a buyer representation agreement and then was shown a couple of properties. You would want to then ask for the list of properties that the agent protected if that buyer agreement is either canceled or you're showing them other properties. All right. The next, paragraph 3 is property be acquired. You can be somewhat broad. You could probably get away with San Diego County. You might even get away with San Diego County and Riverside County, because if some of us working in the North County, we might have property or buyers rather that would consider Temecula as well as maybe Fallbrook or something like that. And so you could state a couple of counties. That's probably acceptable. Price range in a $1 to 10 million. That's not going to work. Just like any property in the state of California is not going to work. Why? Because courts have invalidated contracts that have too broad a reach. And so clearly anything in the state of California or anything priced 1 million or $1 to 10 million is too broad. I always tell agents, look, there's a minimum that the buyer is going to spend because he's not going to buy a little 1-bedroom house. So could you say 500 if they're looking for a 3-bedroom home on the coast? I think so, but they're not going to find anything for 3 times that. So you could say 500 and then take their upper limit and add 500,000 to that. They're not qualified for that, or they don't have that much cash anyway. So could you say 500 to 3 million? You probably could. That's not too broad. So just be careful there, but err on the side of being a little on the broad side. Saying something like in Escondido from 700,000 to 900,000, that's going to be way too limiting. So all right, now compensation. Of course, that's a very important part of this form, and this form has the legally required disclosure regarding any member of the public who's signing a commission agreement in real estate. This has to be on that agreement. So this is on all the listing forms. It's on the single party compensation agreement. It's on this form as well. So that starts out right there. That meets the civil code requirements. Now the buyer agrees to pay the broker a percent of the acquisition price and any dollars, if you want, put any dollars down there. Avoid things like 3% and TC fee. Just put down, what is your TC charge? If the TC charges you $450, then put 3% and $450. Avoid the phrase TC after that. That is somewhat problematic. We really should not be specifying the buyer paying administrative fees that traditionally are part of what a real estate agent does anyway. There's both state regulations and federal regulations that make that not a very good practice. So if you want your TC covered, you just put down 3% plus, and then put a dollar amount, 450 or 500 or 350, and that'll be covered that way. You could also check the box, and if it's just a flat dollar amount, period, you can check that box. Or if you had a schedule, if they bought here or bought your listing, you'll charge the buyer less commission, something like that. You can have an attached schedule. Okay, your right to compensation. The broker is entitled to compensation from the buyer if during the representation period or any extension, the buyer enters into agreement to purchase or lease or otherwise acquire the property that's described in paragraph 3 that we just looked at. So if they buy a property identified in paragraph 3, fits that description, and you have this agreement, then you're entitled to compensation, providing that the seller completes the transaction or is prevented from doing it by default of the buyer. If the buyer defaults on a purchase agreement, and you have a buyer representation agreement, the buyer could still be liable for your commission. And there are quite a bit of specific paragraphs, all of paragraph 4, all the subparagraphs that detail how this compensation can be paid and under what circumstances. So we'll look at those one by one. So the first one we want to look at is 4B1, a non-exclusive representation. This form defaults to non-exclusive. So what does that mean? That means you're paid for any home that you are involved in. And involvement is defined. So it's not just any home that you showed the buyer. It's more than that. That's the good news. This form actually broadens your right to claim a compensation from the buyer for performing services for the buyer. And they defined involvement here. So if you're involved in the property acquisition in the way it's detailed, we'll go through it in a minute, then you have a right to be compensated. But it's not an exclusive right. If they buy a home that you don't know anything about, you've never seen, you're not involved in it at all, unless the next box is checked, we'll cover that in a minute, then you would not be entitled to compensation. But let's look at that broker involvement a little bit more detail. What does involvement mean? It's defined. If the buyer physically entered the home or was shown the home by the broker. So if you showed the home, you have the right to be compensated for that home. That's a pretty broad statement, actually. It also includes any property you showed virtually. So if you walked somebody through over the phone or on a Zoom call through a property. Now, it's important. We're going to see this in a minute. Simply sending a buyer a link to a virtual property to view virtually is not sufficient. You have to be involved. So keyword here is you showed the property to the buyer virtually, not I sent a link to the buyer, told him, here, check this out. That probably won't help you. Okay, if you submitted an offer, then you were involved in the property. If the property was introduced by you to the buyer and you acted on the buyer's behalf. So simply sending a list of properties is not sufficient introduction. What you have to also do is act on the buyer's behalf. So you send them a list of properties and then you call them and you go through some of those properties when on the phone. Maybe you click through some of the pictures or you click onto the virtual tour. Maybe you do some investigation for them. I checked this property, what school district it's in. I checked on the history of this property. It's been on the market for a little while. It fell out of escrow, but it looks like it's a pretty nice home for you. See, anything that you did on the buyer's behalf other than simply sending them a list would probably qualify you as being involved in that property. And if you have broker involvement in any property the buyer acquires, you have a right to compensation. So this is actually a pretty broad agent-friendly clause in this paragraph. Okay, in this agreement. Now, if you check 4B2, then it becomes an exclusive representation and it's just like a listing agreement that is an exclusive right to sell. Most of you all only take exclusive right to sell listing agreements. The RLA is an exclusive right to sell. What does that mean? That means if the seller sells the property to his brother, you get paid. Of course, if he sells it through the MLS, you get paid. If he sells it to his neighbor, you get paid. If the seller sells the property, you get paid. That's what an exclusive right to sell is. An exclusive right to represent the buyer in acquisition of property is the same thing. If the buyer buys a property, they run off on a Sunday, go to an open house in a neighborhood you've never been in before, and they end up writing an offer, and you have this box checked, then you have a right to be paid. You have an exclusive representation agreement. So it is exclusive, and this is a little strange they put irrevocable because it is cancelable. So I'm not sure why Carr put that in there, because you're going to see in a minute, this can be canceled, and you'll see under the terms by which it can be canceled. But not necessarily. You can check a box where no, it can't be canceled, but it can be. Okay. The broker is entitled to compensation. The buyer acquires a property during the representation period with or without involvement, just as I had referenced before. Now, as I said, this agreement can be canceled, which makes it very buyer friendly. If it's a non-exclusive right, it makes sense it can be canceled. I'm involved. I get paid in any property I'm involved in, but I don't get paid on anything I'm not involved in. And if you don't want me to be involved in any more properties for you, it makes sense, if you're the buyer, for you to cancel the agreement, or for me to cancel the agreement. So either the buyer or the broker can cancel this agreement by giving notice to the other in writing. Now, if 4B1 applies, and the 4B1 is the non-exclusive clause we just looked at. So if you're involved in the property, that's a 4B1 situation. So if 4B1 applies, then the cancellation is either upon receipt of the notice, or you can check a box so many days after receipt of the notice, the agreement's canceled. Now, don't worry, you'll see in a minute how you're still protected on properties you already were involved in. Cancellation is not retroactive. Okay, I'm canceling the agreement, now I don't owe you anything. No, you cancel the agreement going forward, you don't owe me anything. But if I showed you property in the past, provided I do things like provide you a list of those properties within a certain time period after the cancellation, I still get paid. So this cancellation is not as scary as you might think it is. It's a going forward cancellation, which I would argue is very, very buyer friendly, and it makes sense to the broker. If the buyer doesn't want to work with you anymore, what are you going to do? You're going to force them to look at property with you? I don't think so. So it's not as bad as you may think it is, because you are protected on the looking backwards. It's just a cancellation going forward. So now if 4B2 applies, that's the exclusive right, then the cancellation is effective 30 days after the receipt of the notice. Now, the broker, like I just said, is still entitled to compensation if during that representation period, the buyer acquires a property for which there was broker involvement. That's, in other words, you showed them a property, they didn't buy it. A week later, they want to cancel, don't want to work with you, they want to work with somebody else. All right, you get a cancellation. You've got to give them a list of the properties you've shown them, and you're protected. And if they buy that property, you are compensated. So, like I said, it's not a backwards cancellation, it's a forward cancellation. Now, here's detailing what I just said. The buyer delivers a list to the broker. You can do that on the form Notice of Broker Involved Properties. That's what the NBIP is. It's a form. You see it in your booklet. We'll go through it in detail next week, but it's a form where you can list the properties that you were involved in. You can list the properties, you sent them virtual tours, and then you called them and reviewed that virtual tour with them. You can list properties, you sent them these properties, and then followed up with some information about these properties. This one's in the school district you like. This one is also in the school district you like, and additionally has no mellow roofs. I checked on that. See, that's all broker involvement. So you can give them a list of those properties, and when you give them that list, you have to give them that list within 5 days of a cancellation. You have to give the list prior to expiration of this agreement if it expires. But if the buyer, or you for that matter, cancel this agreement, then you have 5 days after cancellation to give that list. Now, if 4B2 applies, in other words, it's an exclusive right, then you can check C2 and state that neither party has the right to cancel unless both parties agree. So the right to cancel is not unlimited. It's not totally universal. So you're pretty well protected. All right, now counting for payments to the broker by other parties. So the buyer signs this, let's say he signs it for 3%. He buys a house, he's obligated to pay you 3%. All right. However, if anyone other than the buyer compensates the broker for services, i.e. the MLS says 3%, the broker representation agreement says 3%, well, you credit what you get through the MLS or from another party, the listing agent, against what the buyer owes you, and then the buyer pays the difference. So it's 3% in the MLS and 3% on your buyer broker agreement, your buyer representation agreement. The buyer owes you nothing. If it's 3% on the buyer representation agreement and 2.5% in the MLS, then the buyer only owes you 0.5%. You don't get 5.5% because you have a buyer broker agreement for 3 and you sold a property in the MLS that paid you 2.5. Doesn't work that way. So this is how you can show the buyer that in fact you're not allowed to say my services can be free. They're never free. Excuse me, because the Department of Justice recognizes that whatever the seller's going to pay you is built into the price. So you can't say my services are free, but you can say the cost of my services can be covered by the seller. See, you don't have to be out of pocket to pay me this. All right. So that's one situation. Now, what happens if the third-party agreement is in excess of what the buyer broker agreement is? So you have a buyer broker agreement for 2.5, and oh my goodness, I got a listing here that's paying me 3. Well, the default is you get that extra half as well. The excess goes to the broker, or you can check this box and credit it to the buyer. I had a friend when I was selling real estate, who used this very clause. This clause existed in the old buyer representation agreements that Carr had. And he used this very clause to tell buyers why he felt it was important that they have an agreement, because he did not want the buyer to suffer or feel like the agent might influence the buyer because he's getting a bonus or an extra commission. So anything above the buyer broker agreement, I want to give it to you. And that was his way of presenting this agreement. And he was pretty successful at getting it signed. So if it's paid in excess, you have to, the default is you get the excess, or you can check the box, the buyer gets it. Okay. Now, the third thing that's on this clause that's important is the authorization to include compensation to you by the seller to cover anything that the MLS commission doesn't cover in the buyer broker agreement. So back to that example, the buyer broker agreement says 3% and the MLS says 2.5. Well, the default is you are authorized, because it's a default, you're authorized to ask the seller to pay that 0.5% on behalf of the buyer. So, and that is, that's still a somewhat misunderstood clause in the RPA. That's in your booklet as well. The RPA, page 2, paragraph 3G3. That is only matters when you have a buyer broker agreement and the buyer broker agreement calls for the buyer to pay a commission greater than what the seller is offering through the MLS. So that clause, the seller is in the RPA, the seller is agreeing to pay the shortfall. So the seller's already going to pay the 2.5 because that's in the MLS. Actually, the listing agent's going to pay it to you, but the listing agent is, the seller's paying it to the listing agent's passing it on to you. You're getting the 2.5. Now the buyer still owes 0.5% because that 2.5 was credited according to paragraph D1. It was credited against this agreement. 0.5% is left, so you can ask the seller to pay that 0.5%, and the buyer would then have no out-of-pocket expense for that shortfall. So if you check this, then the buyer does not authorize that to be part of the purchase agreement. I would argue, even if they don't check this box, if you go with the default and you're authorized, I would still review that with the buyer, because obviously it will have an impact on the offer. So unless you're offering a very good price, or there's, especially in a multiple offer situation, your price is going to have to compensate the seller for that extra 0.5% in my example. So review all that with the buyer a bit. It may not be in the buyer's best interest to ask the seller to pay that difference. There's nothing that says you can't modify this agreement to reduce the commission on this transaction to what the MLS is paying you. So I sign a buyer broker agreement with a buyer for 3%. We find a house the buyer just loves and they're only paying 2% and there's 17 offers. Well, you're going to have a pretty tough time getting the seller to pay that extra 1%. And the buyer is not too happy about paying the 1%. And I may be willing to say, on this transaction, I'm willing to modify the compensation due me as a result of the buyer representation agreement from 3% to 2%. That way, there's no extra cost to you. And so you do an MT. That form is in your handout. I'll cover how to fill that out in detail. If you get in that situation before we do the next class, call me. But you do an MT, and then on this particular transaction, reduce the commission. I wouldn't do it for all transactions unless you're willing to do that. Okay. The buyer, the amount of money will be paid to the broker through escrow. Okay. Now, additional broker right to compensation. This is a so-called protection clause, just like the listing contract has. Look, if you sell this house within X number of days after the expiration of my listing, I still get paid, provided you sell it to somebody who's entered the property during my listing period, and I give you a list of who those people are. So this is the exact same clause in the buyer broker agreement. And so you could put in something like 180 days if you wanted. If you buy a house within 180 days after the expiration of this that I was involved in, again, that's such a better concept than that I showed you. See, I was involved in. I researched this property for you. I sent information to you about this property. Contacted the seller on your behalf or the listing agent on your behalf about this property. Now you have to provide them the list, and the list that you would provide them is the NBIP. So the broker would be entitled to compensation in 4A, which is the paragraph that says how much you're going to be paid, how much the buyer owes you. If within X number of days after the expiration of the agreement that they acquire a property, so you want to fill that in. If you don't fill that in, just like a listing contract, if you don't put that number in that blank, this clause is not in force. It's not effective, because it's 0 days, and so it means nothing. So be sure you put a number there. If the buyer enters into agreement to acquire that property, and you were involved in it, then and you deliver the list of properties, the NB notice of broker involved property, the NBIP form, you would be compensated. So that's nice. Okay, disclosure of anticipated payments to brokers by others. This is where CAR is NAR, actually. CAR is supportive of it. They're stepping this up. This is what the DOJ is going to ultimately require. And that is, when you enter into a contract, the DOJ and NAR is already on board with that. They're already suggesting that a true picture includes your compensation for representing the buyer in this purchase, provided there is no buyer broker agreement. See, so I'm sorry, misspoke. Provided the buyer is not paying all the commission. So if the seller's paying no commission, then you don't have to tell the buyer again how much commission he's paying, because the agreement is already saying that. But if the seller is paying you a commission to sell a property, the code of ethics is moving toward that needs to be disclosed. The dollar amount that commission you are getting needs to be disclosed to the buyer, because that's what the DOJ was suing NAR for. that we were keeping it a secret, we being in the real estate industry. I wasn't, but the real estate industry was keeping it a secret from the buyers how much compensation we get when we sell a house. And as I said earlier, and I don't fault the DOJ for this concept. And this concept is the buyer's paying that commission. It's built into the price. So I can't, and NAR and CAR, they feel the same way. You really can't argue with the DOJ. How they want to go about it's sort of awful, quite bluntly put. But the fact that they feel the buyer should know how much commission their agent is getting, that makes sense. And that is the direction we are going in. So, the buyer, you can, prior to writing an offer, you disclose the compensation you're getting. Or if you check this, prior to showing a property, I would argue, that's a lot of trouble. Every time you show a property, you got to tell them how much commission you're getting. Although it could be pretty easy. You could, just, give them an MLS printout, hard to say fast, of the property showing the compensation. Right now, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't list and sell, so I'm not 100% certain, but I don't think the buyer copy of the MLS printout lists the commission. That is changing. Many MLSs are now including the commission paid to the buyer broker in anything that's printed out for the benefit of the buyer. So if you print a buyer flyer out of the San Diego MLS, I don't think they put that commission there yet. So you'd have to disclose that to them if you check this box on every property you show, or simply disclose it, prior to writing an offer. Okay, you disclose the compensation you'll receive from the third party. And you can do that by providing a copy of the MLS, or you can do the ABCD form, anticipated broker compensation disclosure. It's in your booklet. You can list the properties and how much commission you're going to get. Now, if the broker will disclose through escrow the final compensation the broker receives from anyone other than the buyer. The buyer knows how much compensation they're paying you, but if you're being paid anything by the seller, that's to be disclosed at the close of escrow. Now, the buyer is responsible for the payment of compensation, even if third party does not pay as anticipated. So that's just kind of a boilerplate protection clause for you. All right, timing of the compensation. When are you paid this money? Upon completion of the transaction, then you're entitled to compensation. If the acquisition is prevented by default of the buyer, then you're also entitled to compensation, and you get paid upon the buyer's default. Theoretically, good luck with that. Immediately, you might have to file a claim for it. Now, if the acquisition is prevented by another party's default, and the seller collects damages as a result of a suit, then you get 1/2 of the damages recovered, not to exceed the compensation you're entitled to. So if they, get $10,000, and your buyer broker agreement would have given you for 25,000, you're only going to get 5 because they recovered only 10, and you get half of that. So that's getting in the weeds a bit. You're probably not going to get involved in that too much. I might be. You may be, talking to me if that situation comes up. All right. So you're paid through escrow. And it's an irrevocable agreement that the buyer instructs escrow to pay you anything the buyer owes you. And if there's a pre-existing compensation agreement, and that's what I referenced early on in paragraph 2, where you're signing this agreement and the buyer is saying, I don't have any other pre-existing agreements, or I have no other broker involved properties. I haven't been given any list of properties prior, upon cancellation of a prior agreement. I didn't get any list. So, but if there was such a list, then you would not be entitled to compensation if the buyer ended up buying one of those properties listed in paragraph 2 of this agreement. Okay, now the balance of this form is going to be pretty quick, so we'll finish right on time, maybe a little over for questions. So, an AD is provided with this agreement, as is a PRB, as permission to represent, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Also contains permission to act as a dual agent. That's pretty simple. Now, the buyer authorization obligation, let me zoom through this quickly. But this is kind of a nice clause. I would walk the buyer through this. These are the things I'm going to do for you. This is what you're compensating me for. And like I said, ultimately, the seller may cover that cost for you. So let me walk you through that. So locating and presenting properties to you, presenting offers and negotiating the acceptance of those offers, facilitating the escrow process, ordering reports and investigations as directed by the buyer, scheduling and attending any meetings and appointments with professionals chosen by the buyer, to provide a list of professionals who can provide you services in connection with this escrow. Also to assist you in financing, to provide referrals to lenders that I'm familiar with, who I can vouch that will probably do a good job for you, and let me help you with that. So there's quite a few things you're going to do there that are listed. If the property is 1 to 4 residential units, I'm going to do a visual inspection and report those results to you. Now, the buyer's obligation, they got to act in good faith. They got to provide you personal and financial information so that you can be sure they're qualified for any home they're buying. That's part of the pre-qualification process. Act, with reasonable care and other professional assistance, select professionals to perform inspections and investigations on your behalf, and agree to pay for reports and investigations arranged by the broker that you may need to facilitate this transaction. A very important obligation the buyer has is to provide you with any material issues they have. And of course, that's done with the BMI. And we'll talk about that. Again, I'll remind you about that next month. The BMI is a required form if you work with buyers, and it's only if you work with buyers, where the buyer tells you in advance any specific concerns that they have going into a transaction that would make or break the transaction for them, that they would want to know about that prior to completing the transaction. And attorney's fees, it's interesting on this form, unlike the listing agreement, the prevailing party is entitled to attorney's fees. In this agreement, each party pays their own attorney fees. Mediation is a part of this agreement, and then mediation terms are you do not mediate anything that's a small claims matter. You can, but you're not obligated to. So that's in there. With this form, advisories do print, the buyer transaction advisory that has some, it's very similar to the buyer's investigation advisory. The buyer's transaction advisory collected all those advisory clauses that were in the old buyer representation agreement. They decided, they being CAR, decided not to put them in the agreement, but to put them as a standalone advisory form. That made a lot of sense. And this is the entire agreement. If there's an entity buyer, you check that and fill that out appropriately. And then the buyer and the seller, and the broker sign it as appropriate. Folks, that concludes part 1, where we went through the form. I hope I didn't overwhelm you with the details. I hope you have a better feel for it. I hope you're a little more comfortable with it, and maybe you start using it. I just give it, a non-exclusive, easy to do. They can cancel it. It protects your commission under a lot of different circumstances. So encourage you very much to use that form. Now, does anybody have any questions? Lindsay, do we have anything in chat?
No questions in chat, but Dennis had his hand up.
Okay, yeah, any raised hands? Go ahead. Dennis.
Okay, yeah, actually I did have one in chat, and It said, I just checked and the buyer's page of the MLS does include the buyer's agent compensation.
It does.
It does, yes.
Good. Excellent. Thank you.
And my second question was in D3, listing agent compensation. I thought that we weren't able to ask for compensation in our purchase offer.
Right. That's a great question, Dennis, by the way. So let me explain that, because that's misunderstood. I understand why it is. That's an extremely common question, by the way. So yeah, Code of Ethics does not, prohibit a buyer's agent from negotiating an additional commission paid by the seller via the, through the vehicle of an offer. In other words, we'll buy your house, but only if you pay me 3%, not 2.5%. That's prohibited. Now, you can ask the listing agent to ask the seller if they're willing to pay 3%. You use a CBC for that, but you cannot put that as part of an offer. Just like a seller, a listing agent can't counter back, we'll accept your offer, but only if your agent takes 2% rather than the 2.5% we offered in the MLS. That's prohibited. By the way, we had an agent violate that, not one of our agents, by the way. But just recently, I was prepared to defend that, but the transaction fell out for other reasons. So a listing agent can't use the offer to negotiate reduced commission either. All right. That is not what's happening here. What's happening here is you are asking the seller to cover a buyer obligation. It's not any different than asking the seller to pay my lender costs, to pay my Alta policy. The contract, the boilerplate says that the buyer, will pay for the lender's policy, the seller will pay for the buyer's policy. So the contract says, the commission, the escrow each pay their own. But then you could ask, look, pay my escrow fees. I don't want to pay any escrow fees. So you can negotiate with the seller, you being the buyer through the buyer's agent, the seller covering a buyer expense. And so the seller can say no to that, by the way. No, I'm not going to make up your shortfall, Mr. Buyer. You're going to have to make it up yourself. I'm giving the buyer's agent 2.5%. Your commission agreement with your agent, your buyer broker agreement, your buyer representation agreement says 3%. I'm not paying that 0.5%. You got to pay it yourself. They're two separate things. One is a buyer cost. The other is trying to negotiate an increased seller obligation to pay commission. That makes sense?
So would you include that in your offer as here's our buyer broker agreement, and it says 3% and you're only paying 2.5%, and therefore we want.
The way you do it, Dennis, is on page 2 of the RPA. It's paragraph 3G3. You check that box and you ask the seller to agree to pay that obligation that the buyer has. Now, if he agrees to that, ultimately you're going to have to provide proof that you have a buyer broker agreement, because 3G3 is only applicable if, number one, the buyer and the buyer's agent have an agreement between them, a buyer representation agreement between them. Number two, that agreement is calls for a commission greater than what the seller's paying the buyer's agent. So if those two things are true, then you can ask the seller to make up that difference. But again, the seller is paying a buyer cost on behalf of the buyer. He's not paying more commission. It sounds like it's more commission, but no, he's paying his 2.5%, plus he's paying 0.5% that the buyer is also obligated to pay.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Jeannie says that she's seeing some discount agents with low co-ops stating in the MLS that any seller credits may not be used for buyer agent fees. Is anyone else seeing this? And will the BRBC combat this?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, a good question if anybody else is seeing that. The BRBC is an agreement between the buyer and the buyer's broker. So the listing agent and or seller are not bound by any terms in that agreement. Not to get off in the weeds here, but a common mistake agents make, not a week that doesn't go by that I have to explain this. And again, I'm not being critical. Just think about this. Two people can't bind a third party to perform unless that third party is part of the agreement. Lindsay and I can't sign an agreement that MasterCard will waive my monthly fee this month or whatever. No, I have to have that agreement with MasterCard. So we can't bind a third party. So the buyer representation agreement does not obligate the listing agent or the seller to do anything. It can't, because they're not a part of that agreement. So they are proactively saying, we're not going to pay any credits. I think it sounded to me like it was more general. They're not paying any buyer fees. So they don't want any, pay buyer closing costs offers. That you can put that in MLS. It doesn't mean you can't write it in an offer. Things are negotiable. I would review with the buyer. There's a good chance they're going to turn this down because they're telling me in the MLS. By the way, the offer, what does the offer say? The home is sold as is. The seller accepts the offer. What's the seller saying? Home is being sold as is, but sellers still agree to make repairs. So, the listing agent can say, we will not accept any offers that include credits, for buyer fees. I would have a verbal conversation with the listing agent. I understand. I read the MLS. The buyer wants to ask. They made a very nice price. I would argue you pay 10 grand over list price, and you have 3,000 in fees you want paid. I think the seller's going to change their mind real quick. So it's negotiable, even though they put that in the MLS. Does that answer your question, Jeannie? Did she say yes? Oh, well.
Yes, she said yes.
Yes. Okay, great.
And then
questions?
Emily Zach had a question. Is
Yes.
this form protectable to new construction if your buyer goes in without you?
Well, see, I want to think through this a minute. I'm about to say something. I want to make sure I'm right. If a buyer goes to new construction, unless you have an exclusive agreement, in other words, you've checked the box in 4B2. It's an exclusive. You buy any house, I get paid. If you don't check 4B2 and a buyer goes to a builder without you, and you didn't, you weren't involved in getting them there. I mean, you're not entitled to compensation anyway. Now, if you told the buyer about this builder and you did some research about the builder and you gave them a printout out of the MLS that talked about the features of the home, and then you talked about, now there's mellow roofs in this construction, but the builder's going to pay the first 3 years of your mellow roof. So you do a little bit of involvement, then yeah, you'd be compensated. The buyer would be obligated to compensate you. The builder isn't. Again, you cannot bind the builder. The builder is not a part of this agreement. I have a buyer broker agreement. You have to pay me. Builder doesn't have to pay you. The buyer has to pay you. That's who the agreement's with. Does that help you, Emily? Emily doesn't. Not there. You're okay.
She was texting me her question.
yes.
Okay, she said
good,
yes.
good. Any other
Yes.
questions?
Thanks, Lindsay.
Sure.
Yes,
There's
I have
no-
another one that I mentioned in the notes. How are lenders handling the buyer paid commissions in the loans?
That-
Um,
Again, Dennis, you are asking excellent questions. That is the big challenge now. In moving in the direction that buyers are going to be paying for their agents and sellers are going to be paying for their agents. Well, it's easy. No, I shouldn't say easy. It might not be easy, but sellers got net proceeds. I'm selling my house. I'm netting $140,000 before expenses. And one of my expenses is a listing agent, $12,000. Well, I got the money, I can pay them. A buyer frequently has scraped every nickel together they've got, saved for 2.5 years, can barely make the down payment and closing costs. And now the direction is you're also going to have to pay your agent. Right now, lenders do not allow financing of the commission amount. And there's a lot of thought, a lot of discussion in task force that lenders will allow the commission that a buyer pays to their broker to be added, to the loan amount. In other words, be financeable one way or another. They're not sure how the vehicle will be. Got a lot of other problems. How do you insure these loans? What is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac going to say? I mean, there's a lot of discussion, but that is a big challenge. I can tell you, lenders have a somewhat prejudiced view of a buyer even paying a commission. I've been involved in years past in 2 transactions where the buyer paid their own agent commission, and they had the cash. They had the money, make it part of my closing costs. They had the down payment. The lender initially in both situations, one was a VA, by the way, said it's not allowed. I was able to argue, yes, it is allowed. If they come back, that's not legal, that's not right. Well, there's a car form. The car allows it, NAR allows it. Come on. And so, but the lenders don't like. Right now, their attitude is they think the seller should be paying the commission, not the buyer. But they're a little bit behind the 8 ball. There are task force looking at how our lenders going to handle that. There's no definitive answer yet, Dennis, but you're very perceptive in the fact that that is probably the biggest hurdle to overcome in getting all these things in place where buyers pay their own agents and sellers pay their own agents.
That's
Any
it.
other questions?
There's no other questions in the chat.
Okay, well, I hope you got something out of this class, got a better understanding of the form. I hope you start using it. Call me with questions. Tune in next month. I will take you through the associated forms, and we'll spend a little extra time on the BMI as well. I think we'll have time for that. I want to be sure everybody's comfortable with using that form. In the meantime, have a great, great rest of the month, and take care.
Thanks, Walt.
Thanks,
Thanks so
Walt.
much, Walt, for going through
Thank
this
you, Walt.
form.
Bye.
Thanks, Walt.